I fully anticipate the ACC to collapse within the next couple of months. If it's a little bit later, regardless, I think it's going to happen. If you're a college football fan that doesn't really pay attention to what happens behind closed doors, not saying I have any sources, I just read what the media says and what they hear because they have sources. And it seems like the momentum is leaning towards the ACC being the next conference to collapse, and we start entering that super conference era. You could even potentially say that we're already in that. But teams like Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, I kind of anticipate are going to be playing for a different conference within the next 5 years. There's a lot of legal battles going on. I'm going to kind of keep the motivations behind it very high level because I'm not educated enough to talk about the legal terms around this. And then we're going to talk about the title of today's video, which is what would be the best fit for most of these teams. A lot of these conferences aren't really acting like they want to take in more just because they're going to be splitting up the piece of the pie a little bit more. But I think that's partially because we have a lot of legal battles going on, so they don't want to have anything overlapping. I assume as soon as these are cleared and these teams are allowed to leave the ACC and that collapse finally happens, these conferences are going to open up just because they see the money on the plate. And I'm also going to talk about some of the ACC teams that could be left behind, either potentially going to an independent era or, maybe a conference steps up and becomes a new player into this 12-team playoff. But let's first talk about the motivations. Obviously, with any conference realignment, it's money. They see a $20 million gap when it comes to the college football playoff revenue between the Big Ten and the SEC versus the ACC. That's a big enough gap in a new era where every dollar seems to count, whether that's NIL facilities, stadiums, like everything around that. And if we even go into an era where schools are paying for their players, like they are directly paying from the institutions, they're going to want as much money as they can because they've seen what it's like to not have to pay the players, and they want to hold that standard. Paying players is going to cut into their revenue and profit, so they're going to want to find every way to make more money. We've seen it with the Big 12 and wanting to add sponsors to uniforms and jerseys and everything around that because that's a creative way to make money. They're not just doing that because, obviously it's to make more money. They're being forced to because of the new rules. Whether you disagree or agree to it, that's not the point of this video. That's for a completely another day. Which, side note, I hate what all this is doing. As soon as College Football 25 comes out, everyone's going back to their old conference like it's 1997 because, just to be transparent, if you want to hear my full opinion on this, it's disgusting. I hate every part of this. It feels like the soul of college football is just getting destroyed right now because of all this conference realignment. Like, it's going to feel great in a video game, but it's going to be a sad reality knowing that this is just not what the sport's going to be. And at some point, someone's going to have to step in if they're going to want to make college football feel normal again. Because once we start getting to these 20-team super conferences and trying to make it feel like the NFL, this is just going to be straight up lame. It's just objectively going to be lame because this was such a unique sport. The fan bases are so unique and passionate that it feels like it's slowly dying year in and year out as we continue with the conference realignment, NIL, the recruiting, like everything about it is just almost feeling like a watered down drink. Like it still kind of reminds me of college football, but just truthfully, it's just not. You see what happens in 10 years. Just imagine what the sport's going to look like in 5. And that's the money aspect. But another reason why a lot of teams want to leave the ACC, they just saw what happened with Florida State. We could go round in circles with how players feel, how coaches, how fans feel about Florida State getting screwed, going 13-0 and putting in Alabama over them. We could do that whole argument again. But objectively, Florida State feels screwed because they were in the ACC. They played a lighter schedule than what the SEC and the Big Ten objectively would have been playing. And it's only going to get worse. When we're talking about the 12-team playoff and we look at all the at-large teams outside of the conference champs, the committee should be more lenient towards the SEC and the Big Ten if they want to stay consistent because they're going to be playing way more difficult schedules with the collapse of the Pac-12 and then Texas and Oklahoma joining the SEC. So this is only going to get worse. So Florida State looks around and says, well, if we're going to get screwed going 13-0, I'd much rather have the breathing room of 1 to 2 losses being in a much more difficult conference. We're a big enough brand. We want a piece of the pie. We're going to push our way out of the ACC. And Clemson, one of the biggest powers in college football, they can do the same thing. And now North Carolina is trying to get a piece of the pie and do that as well. So you have these three teams that are looking to move out. They're going through the legal process, the exit fees, everything around it, because of those two motivations of money and wanting to get the benefit of the doubt. And there is a world where maybe the ACC doesn't fully collapse and maybe they just take a step back. Don't even get me started on the fact that we have Cal in the Atlantic Coast Conference. I could make that joke every single time. It still bothers me. And then you have SMU joining, but we're going to be talking about what are the best spots for the four teams that are seemingly at the top or could be pushing themselves out. Miami, North Carolina, Clemson, and Florida State. Miami being the only one that has kind of stuck with the ACC, and I believe they're just such a unique situation being a private school and their facility. Like, I don't even want to get into that, but I believe if the ACC and those teams were leaving, they would leave as well. Let's first talk about Clemson. I think Clemson would fit great in the SEC. Their fan base, everything around Clemson fits perfectly with what the SEC wants. They already have a rivalry with South Carolina. I believe they could build something up with Georgia. We know what they were like with Alabama during that Saban versus Dabo era of like 4 straight national titles. I think they are a great fit in the SEC. But if we're talking about Florida State, man, Florida State could either be in the Big Ten or the SEC. I think they would be a better fit in the SEC just geographically, but we know that doesn't matter. We have Cal in the ACC. But Florida State could easily want to be in the Big Ten, make that a mega conference, or be in the SEC, play with teams like Florida and kind of more geographically fit. They have the fan base around it. They have the pedigree. They have the history, like everything you could ask for in an SEC team joining. Florida State has it. And man, would it make it an insane conference to be in when you have potentially Clemson and Florida State in the SEC. But part of the concern I have is I don't know if the SEC is going to want to do that. And maybe the Big Ten is more open to adding teams, and that's a world where that could happen. And the two teams I feel more confident potentially going to the Big Ten is honestly Miami and North Carolina. I could honestly see North Carolina going to the Big 12 as well. Just think about the basketball side of things. I understand football is the moneymaker here, but putting North Carolina in a basketball type of conference that is the Big 12 with Houston, Kansas, Kansas State. Oh my gosh, just incredible conference basketball play. They could become like a super basketball conference, which would be really awesome. But I also think North Carolina would be a good fit in the Big 12, but I don't know if they see themselves as anything less than what the Big 10 and the SEC potentially could offer. I think personally, I would want them in the Big 12 just because I think they would have more enticing matchups and maybe geographically it fits a little bit better. But if I had to pick between the Big 10 and the SEC, I think they would go with the Big 10, and I think Miami would do as well. One of the Florida schools, I believe, is going to have a Big 10 presence. There's a rumor that that is something that the Big 10 had a lot of interest in. So one of the Florida schools that is looking to move on has to get one of these teams, like from the Big 10. And I think Miami is more likely to do it, but that's, like I said, Florida State easily could be one of those teams that wants to be in the Big 10. I remember in the College Football 25 trailer, they already moved Florida State into the Big 10. Someone in their offices thought it would be a little funny, and I thought it was as well, but one of those teams is going to end up being in the Big 10 regardless because they want to have that presence down south. If the rest of the ACC gets left behind, I could see teams like Duke going to the Big 12 because I fully expect the Big 12 to be very aggressive. Comparative to the ACC and the Pac-12, which they all kind of were in the same tier, they've been the most aggressive in adding teams because they do not want to get left behind. They saw what happened with Texas and Oklahoma. They just continuously have been adding team after team. It's been one of the most fun conferences to watch. So I fully expect like teams like Duke, I could see Virginia Tech, Virginia, like really dive in and go into the Big 12 because at least they're not left behind like what we have seen with Oregon State and Washington State. But if you're a fan of one of these teams, let me know down in the comments below what you think your team should do and where you guys should land, whether that's the Big 10, the SEC, the Big 12. Maybe you revitalize the Pac-12 somehow. I don't know how that would work, but I really don't know what's going to happen with the ACC. It's honestly sad and sickening to watch this happen to college football, just to be completely blunt with you guys. But if you are new here to Rush the Field, all I will ever ask of you, if you're at this point in the video, is to give me another chance to talk football with you guys. That means the world to me. Whether you're returning or a new subscriber, like, comment, I don't care, man. It means the world that you're giving me a chance to talk football. So all I'll ever ask of you, give me another chance. And have a fantastic day.
you.